Wasyl Krywyn was born on April 4, 1923, to Miketa and Paraskevia Krywyn. His father, Miketa, was born in Ukraine, and his real last name should have been Hilistan. However, Miketa's family, because they lost their father in World War I, took on the maiden name of Krywyn when he did not return. His mother, Paraskevia, was Ukrainian-born to migrant farmers. Her family name was Shulik, and she was born in a province near Romania called Buhovina. Wasyl's ancestors were mostly farmers who handed their land down to their children, and who would then portion it out to their children. They didn't have much, but enough to live. The two met while working as farmers, having gone to a particular area to work on orchards. Wasyl's earliest memory was that of his father helping to build a small house they later lived in. He recalled playing nearby as his father brought dirt, wood, and cement to make the foundation. They gave Wasyl some wood to play with, and he made a wheel out of it, hoping to make a little wheelbarrow. But something got in his eyes and irritated them, causing them to swell up, and his father picked him up, put him over his back, and took him home. There were forests nearby, about half-mile away, with trees that had nuts on them. When the sun was out, there were large bugs that would fly over and sit on the cows, who would swat them away with their tails, bolting into the forest sometimes when they were bitten. At those times, when the cows would bolt off into the forest, Wasyl would cry and cry because it was so hard to find and bring the cow home. Sometimes, to amuse himself, he would even catch those bugs, tie them to a string, and watch them fly around in a circle. One time, as a young boy, he took the cow to graze and fell asleep under a tree. As a gentle rain began, he woke up to find the cow missing. It had no doubt run into the forest, and he began crying. He ran to the woods, frantically searching. He cried and searched for hours, only to come home and find the cow had already returned on her own. Wasyl shared a type of innocence and allegiance to his family. One time as a child, he helped milk the cow to the product of 3 pounds of butter, but their cat got into about a pound of it and ate it. His father jokingly said, "Maybe we should cut the cat's tail off, that would teach it a lesson." And the next day, when they went to the store, Wasyl grabbed the little axe and the cat. He struck the tail, and the cat started screaming and twisting around and got away before he could tie it up where it had been bleeding. He chased it, but the cat got away and hid, but eventually he scared it out and grabbed it when it tried to bolt. To his father's amusement and shame, he cut the cat's tail, once again on the corner of a table, right at its end, near the little cat's bum. The cat ran away and it eventually healed. Despite getting in trouble, Wasyl swore the cat was more peaceful and docile from then on. It would even kill small rabbits and bring them to the house in offering. Wasyl was proud of cutting grass in a field with his father and older brother, carrying a scythe behind them, moving along carefully, cutting with the sharp tool. They would sometimes make gravel by breaking stones with a hammer. He thrived on work, and sometimes doing odd jobs. He was paid in food. For example, 2 bushels of potatoes was a typical wage for a teen. He wanted to be a man, and poured himself into whatever work he did. Later, as an adult, he would keep the same work ethic. He wanted to help his parents. It gave him satisfaction to contribute to the family. Being the second oldest of 8 children, 6 boys and 2 girls, he felt the responsibility to help his family. He saw how hard his parents worked just to have enough to live. Wasyl loved work and proudly spoke of catching crabs in the Hnilalipa River, but would have to do it secretly, sometimes at night with his father, so they didn't get into trouble. He would cross that same river to meet his friends or to gather and socialize and sing with other kids his age. There were some places in the river that were very shallow, maybe 1 or 2 feet, but the water was very fast and could be dangerous at times. By the shore there were holes where crabs would pop their heads out, and if you could grab them, careful not to get pinched and not crack their shells, you could sell them on the market. Crabs with cracked shells would die in a day or two, so you couldn't sell them. However, you could take them home to your family for food, and Wasyl would do this sometimes. They would cook it over a fire, and it was a delicious treat. This, in addition to the penny for small crabs and nickel for larger crabs, would help go a long way to help. When he was about 5, an older girl, probably around 12, that he used to follow around, tied his leg to a bedpost. She was tasked with watching the children that day, but she herself wanted to go with her friends and didn't want to watch the younger kids, so she tied up Wasyl so that he would watch them. Around the same year, in 1928, his brother found a mortar shell from a cannon from World War I that was some 2 by 5 inches long. Unsure of what it was, his brother inspected it before playing with it, and he and Wasyl even tossed it to one another, the long piece of metal. They had seen a local man go around with a cart collecting mortars and other shells, and thought they may be able to sell it. They figured it was worth something and knew of a man collecting them, so they brought it home, thinking they could sell it for some food. He and his brother played with it, tossing it back and forth, until they were tired and set it on the table. 2 of his brothers were carving a pumpkin and pulling out the seeds, while his mother made pierogies and went to the neighbors for pepper. Wasyl then put the bomb on a bench near the stove, going about his chores as his mother left. The shell began making a strange hissing noise. Curious, Wasyl reached to pick it up, and that's when the mortar shell exploded. The shell had blown up part of his hand, near his pinky, and the bottom of his hand and fingers. A few pieces of shrapnel went into his stomach and chest, luckily missing his brothers, who weren't nearby. However, his sister was laying down on the floor near, and a piece flew into her head and neck, nearly killing her. Another family member was standing nearby, had a piece go into her hand and her neck, but the leftover World War I shell, dormant for over 10 years, did the most damage to Wasyl's hand. The explosion was heard a few kilometers away as people came running towards the noise. His parents tried to hold the kids down and remove the shrapnel pieces. As it turned out, a boy named Walter, who later became a teacher, had dug the mortar shell up on his land. Finding this out, Walter's father felt terrible and partially responsible. He went to Wasyl's father and said, "Miketa, please don't worry, I'll pay for the medicine or whatever he needs." But Miketa was proud and did not take any money. Nevertheless, the man felt terrible at the children's injuries, so he occasionally brought flour and meats and other things for the family. With a doctor too far away and no money to pay for help, they treated themselves at home. The best they could do was fish out the pieces and bandage the wounds. Wasyl wrapped his hand with his fist closed and his thumb between his fingers, saying it didn't hurt as much in that position. Eventually, in time, everyone began to heal, but they bore the scars of their near-death experience. Wasyl ended up with a few scars on his sternum and belly, and his hand healed in a semi-closed position. The skin of his pinky fused to his palm, so he couldn't open his hand completely. When he would shake someone's hand from then on, it was noticeable because you could feel his pinky finger, closed, and he would often have to explain what had happened. Living near the center of battles for World War I, they would often find things such as mortar shells and other fragments. Years later, as the Germans pushed Russians to the east of them, the Russians would retreat, leaving some weapons and mortars behind in the rush once again. Those who had fought left in a hurry, leaving cannons and other military equipment on the highways at the time. A few years later, another boy, the son of a church deacon, went around collecting mortar shells. Sometimes he and his brother would graze their cows in a field and look around. He went around collecting the shells, unscrewing them, and collecting the gunpowder. He emptied several shells, eventually enlisting his younger brother to help him. One day he went to his house, and his brother brought a mortar shell. He left, and the younger boy unscrewed it. The shell exploded, killing him, and it was terrible. His mother had to walk around, collecting parts of him in a blanket, and this was the final lesson for Wasyl. Do not go near mortar shells. Don't pick up pieces of things in the fields. The few pennies or powder you got from them wasn't worth the risk. The way he put it, I already had one in my hand as a reminder. When he was around 7, Wasyl used to play, but he would also work, and one time, out of generosity, a neighbor he would help gave him some pants that were less torn than the ones he wore. Grateful, he was no doubt hurt and confused when the same man flew into a rage not long afterward about something he had done. The man beat him, tearing his pants off and throwing his old shredded pants at his feet. When Wasyl was around 9, he moved 30 miles north to where his father was born, even nearer to the water. He would help his father carry stones near the house and build up the property. This place was Nilalipa. It was simple, and kids made things with clay or cut wood in order to make small toys like carriages or wheelbarrows. In the winter, they would make sleighs out of wood, and each side of the river, families pastured their cows and other livestock. Wasyl was proud that he worked at a young age. He was happy to have contributed. He would help his father cut wood and make things like wagons or carriages for the village. In the winter time, they would also carve sleds and have fun. He often saw how hard his parents worked just to make enough to feed their family. 2 bushels of potato was what he usually earned, working all day for a local farmer. He said he was eager to grow up and have money to help his family, and always thought about things he could do to pitch in. The Krywyns lived in a 2-bedroom shack with 6 children. There was a little garden a bit away, and there was water nearby. They were poor and were wearing often what we would consider to be rags, and often only had 1 pair of pants and 1 pair of shoes. Normally they walked barefoot. When they would go to the market to sell things, they would carry their shoes on their backs or shoulders, putting them on only as they reached the town, where the stones and other things that could harm their feet were. They did this to preserve their shoes, because they only could afford 1 pair, and to make them last longer. They would also go barefoot most of the summer, young people and old. Most people were uneducated, and few could read in their village. When Wasyl's older brother was 7, they took him to school about a mile or so away. By the time his father returned home, the brother was already there, determined not to attend school. The teacher had an idea. Maybe you have another son. If you signed him up, he wouldn't run away. So at the age of 6, Wasyl started school, and said he enjoyed it. This was around 1929, and his father's company went bankrupt, and the government ceased it. The government seized most of the land in the area, forcing people to work on collective farms. His father had no money to buy boots for the kids for the winter snow. As a result, Wasyl and his brother would have to alternate days and share the boots. One would wear it one day, and the other the next. Wasyl was proud of this, that he received good marks and learned so much despite his poor attendance and going only every other day. He loved learning new things, but it was around this time that his life became more difficult. They were in hard times. They did things differently, living simply and poorly, compared to the way we live now. They did everything by hand, but at the same time, people had a lot more communication or togetherness. People liked to spend time together. They would come home from work when Wasyl was 16 or so, for example, and go to large trees near the river. The large trees would protect them from the sun and keep them cool while they would talk, joke, sing, and even dance together. Some would bring instruments like the accordion, guitar, or balalaika. They would go in groups with boys and girls, sometimes staying till 11 or 12 midnight, crossing a flimsy bridge to make it there. Wasyl was often nervous crossing the bridge because it was so dilapidated, whistling oftentimes to collect his nerves. Wasyl would get in a bit of trouble when he was younger, even fighting. One time at 15, at the Catholic church, he flicked the ear of a boy sleeping in a pew in front of him. The boy turned quickly but didn't catch him. He waited for the boy to start dozing again and flicked his ear again. The boy understood who was doing it, and when the service ended, they left the church, and this boy gave him a big kick. When they were outside, Wasyl, unwilling to let things go, walked up to the boy and punched him as hard as he could in the face. The boy fell down, and he left. Wasyl left, feeling better for it. The following week, the boy brought a dozen or so friends with him. Wasyl expected this and said he hid a stick down his pants. They saw what they thought was a knife and were frightened and ran away, telling their older brothers and the adults. They came after him, but one of Wasyl's friends stopped them, explaining it was only a stick, not a knife. They approached Wasyl, who showed it to them, proving it was no more dangerous weapon. They left him alone that day, but he refused to go back to church for a while. And when they would see each other in town, they would throw rocks at each other from a distance. Perhaps it was common in his village, but fighting was standard, and it was only rare that the police were involved. Wasyl learned to make the first punch, often scaring the person he was fighting. He figured if they knew you would fight and hit them, they would more likely give up or run away. One day, Wasyl was with his friend and his brother, and the police had grabbed them and took them to jail for fighting and causing trouble. This was one of the rare occasions. Wasyl and the boys were beaten with clubs. Wasyl tried to make his stomach hard so that it didn't do as much damage to his internal organs, but his friend and his friend's brother didn't understand this. They beat them very badly, and 3 days later, his best friend died. With the school on each side of the river, groups of kids would form on one side or the other and throw rocks at each other, hollering curses and insults. Some, more daring, would balance on floating pieces of wood to get closer and toss their stones. Nothing too crazy, but they were a bit of troublemakers. But kids were just being kids. They all stopped fighting, Wasyl said, when the Germans came. It was a year's sentence for fighting, and he was unwilling to risk it. He was also nervous about fighting after a bad experience with someone he hit with a stick. They fell unconscious and wouldn't wake up. Terrified, Wasyl shook him violently, but he didn't move, so Wasyl ran away in fear. Thankfully, the person didn't die, and it was only 30 years later that Wasyl could confirm this when he was preaching in Chicago and saw the man. He apologized, but the man did not remember what had happened. Between the fighting between teenagers, there was a larger fighting going on. Poland had occupied Ukraine. The Soviet Union had moved in on the eastern side. Between fighting the two countries for control of fertile land, Russia's revolution helped raise a powerful army, and Ukrainian land in the 1930s was ordered to be collectivized for use by Russia first and to be deported to raise money for the state and for the good of the people. From 1932 to 1933, as I said, mostly in the eastern Ukraine, where Soviet Union controlled the land, western part was occupied by Poland, in 1932 to 1933, Stalin would deliberately, slowly, and forcibly starve millions of Ukrainians to death. They called it the Great Famine, or Sobibor. It is likely that Wasyl they called it Holodomor. It is likely that Wasyl, 9 or 10 years old at the time, didn't understand what was happening when their parents suddenly could not feed them and they all lost weight. He likely didn't know that millions of his countrymen were starving to death, and that despite the abundance of grain they were growing, his fellow countrymen would get none and systematically be forced to starve to death. Stalin did this in order to raise money for arms and to increase the prosperity of Russia. Stalin himself even bragged to Roosevelt that he had killed millions of his own people by starvation and gulags, or internment camps. Ukraine had been occupied on the western side by Poland and on the east by Russia for some time. Russia, to its east, often took the land closest to it, and Poland as well would take the land closest to its country. This is why many people in the eastern Ukraine speak Russian, and people in western Ukraine speak Polish. Technically, when Wasyl was born, things were still under Polish control, and his passport would say Poland if he were to have gotten one. Around this time, Germany signed a peace agreement with Russia and the Soviet Union. Not long afterward, they together would bomb Poland. The fighting was maybe 30 miles away from the border, which wasn't too far from where Wasyl was, and planes could be seen flying to the nearby Polish border. It was the end of August 1939. Wasyl was 16, and his parents went to a wealthy neighbor's house to listen to the radio, because having a radio was something very scarce and rare. They heard on the radio how Stalin had made peace with Hitler, announcing some great pact, and claimed they would have a decade of peace. Within a matter of days, it seemed, they both assaulted Poland, or Ukraine as well, because it was a part of it, on all fronts. Wasyl and his family could hear and see airplanes flying overhead toward Poland. They heard booming at a factory some 30 miles away. The family was afraid, but didn't run away or panic yet. War was not far from them, but it had yet not come to their homes. 2 or 3 days later, small planes seemed to be flying everywhere, very low. His father said they should hide, and they began to scatter when they heard or saw the aircraft. The airplanes seemed to target houses and people for sport, even shooting at cows and horses. They also threw Luftmine, a type of bomb that goes 100 feet or so before exploding. People grew anxious and terrified as the fighting grew closer. The Germans seemed to come quickly. It seemed like only a week or two before, the Russian army began retreating, leaving their large weapons and other material behind. The Russian army was lacking in supplies, and one rumor said that the Russians weren't given enough bullets, being told to shoot Germans and take their bullets. Confident they had more numbers, the Russians would not hesitate to sacrifice some of their own people for the cause. By the end of the week, they were closer and closer, less than a mile away from where Wasyl and his family lived. The family were harvesting and cleaning wheat as they heard planes and cannons firing. They heard "meow, bah," as bombs exploded a mile or two away. Wasyl was in the field with his father, harvesting proso, a millet, in the town of Voroniv. His mother was about a few thousand feet off to the side when they heard a sudden meow and bombs falling not far away in the forest. "Hurry, get away, they're looking for the front, trying to find out where the soldiers are," his father said. They ran to their house as they arrived. A bomb landed, some half a mile away in the field where they had just been standing, leaving a large crater. Another landed near their neighbors, and they were terrified. It seemed as if they would make their way in one direction, and a bomb would go off where they had just been. They would go in the opposite direction, and another bomb would explode where they had just left. Luckily for Wasyl's family, nobody was hurt, though some had been injured or died in the village. When the Russian line was beaten back, things settled down. The Germans didn't fly their planes any longer, and the Russians didn't have much strength left. With enemies on both sides of them and a history of abuse by the Russians, the Soviets, they feared and saw them as more cruel than the German soldiers. Some even spoke about a liberation, that Germany would help Ukraine and give them their own land and country if they joined and helped fight against the Soviets. As the Germans and Russians approached, eventually occupying their village, things became lawless, and people were doing whatever they wanted. Looting ensued as villagers stole from their neighbors and from one another. Accusations were made of one group or another. And there was a group of Ukrainians like a bush gang that formed. They would look for targets during the day, places to loot, people to rob, and would attack them in the evening, beating their victims to death. There was very little order and no law, no policemen. Ukrainians were killing their own. Some took to trying to appease the invaders, going with the Soviets or going with the Germans. Some were informing, claiming that perhaps a neighbor they had issue with was a spy. If you offended the wrong person, they could easily tell the Russians that you were a spy or a traitor, and you'd find yourself either arrested or shot. In the ensuing months, most of the men fighting age had fled, or were hiding in the bushes and trees of the forest. Wasyl's uncle, his father's brother, was hiding, and when he was found, he was beaten, killed, and thrown into the river. A few weeks later, one of the thugs came to borrow something from their neighbor. He refused to give it to the man, and they returned in the evening, breaking his window, beating them, and taking whatever they wanted from his home. Signs went up that Germans wanted all able-bodied men to work, women too. If you volunteered, you were promised a job, food, and shelter, working to help German production, while their men were on the front lines. But if you avoided the soldiers and never came in, continuing to hide in the fields, for example, you could be arrested, deported, or sent to a forced labor camp. And to the east, to go to the Russians, they thought might be even worse. Rape, death, or a gulag, or concentration camp, may follow them. Wasyl had limited choices. Him and his family were hiding out, and eventually were separated. They split up and hid in the adjoining forests, hoping the soldiers would leave them, and that things would go back to normal. Without a radio or any communication, Wasyl had no idea that the war had become full-blown and was only escalating. It was probably nearing October. He took some food and his coat and boots, and decided he would give up and join the Germans, or perhaps the Russians. He didn't know yet. But after the death of his uncle and the neighbor, the family decided it was best for the boys and the young men to go hide and make a decision. Approaching 17 years old, Wasyl spent several days like this, perhaps hoping that the fighting would stop and the two warring countries would return home and leave them and their country in peace. But this was not to be. The first night, Wasyl lay in the bushes with a coat on. The following day, he moved about a half-mile away from the house. He stayed up all night, listening as they approached. As close as a few hundred feet away, he could hear the soldiers nearby. Terrified at how close they had come, the following morning he set off some 20 miles away to an uncle's home, where he would hide out in a similar fashion. After a few days of hiding, soldiers approached him, and Wasyl hid near his uncle's home. One time, when they came so close, he had to dive into the bushes and found himself struggling to stay silent when his face was just inches from a fresh pile of human waste. Wanting to scream, gag, and throw up, he knew that if he made a sound, his life could be over. It must have been very, very difficult and traumatic to keep silent when all you wanted to do was scream. He got away with it and continued hiding for about 2 weeks, alone, the same as his brothers, realizing he had little chance for survival. Wasyl started to consider the idea of surrendering to the Germans to go work, like the signs had shown. The Germans appealed to Ukrainian nationalism, knowing that the bloody war between Russia and Ukraine and the starvation and death of millions of Ukrainians at the hands of Stalin in the 30s had turned many of the Ukrainians against him. They had no hard time convincing many to come and work for the German side. It's almost along the lines of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, more than any political or real arrangements or agreements. The Nazis used propaganda, promising an independent Ukrainian state, which up until then had not existed. There were even signs in some of the major areas, which read, "The German army guarantees you peaceful work for a better and brighter future to work with." And they would encourage people to sign up for volunteer work. Being at the center of fighting and bombing between Germany and Russia, facing air raids, mortars, gunfire, other things, it was only reasonable that people would choose to go work for one side or the other. Germany was overstretched, fighting on numerous fronts, and most of the workers that they had used in their own factories were gone. Women began working in the factories as labor stretched thin, and the Germans thought of new inventive ways to find a labor force. It's said that about 12 million laborers were forced to work, mostly displaced, some forcibly, others voluntarily. Eastern Europeans, 3 million of which were Ukrainians, went to work for the Germans. They were set up in farms or factories to help with the war effort and to give food and supplies to those at home. Stories are told of people being snatched from the streets by soldiers, presumably sent off to forced labor camps. If you turned yourself in and volunteered, you'd be treated better, so many did. In November of 1941, after about 6 months of hiding out, Wasyl surrendered to the German side, going to a German head office set up in a nearby village. He was told he'd be taken to a farm closer to Germany to work with the other dozen or so men who had surrendered themselves around the same time as Wasyl. Hungry, in rags, with only a thin coat to his name, they traveled for a few hours on train before stopping at some type of camp or place for refugees to be organized and shipped to different locations. There were about 1,300 men stationed there, and they were going to share 300 mattresses. A man in uniform told them they would go work for the German cause and be given food and housing and some cigarette rations. After a few days they would be organized and shipped out, and after lining up, giving them some basic information, they were told how to get to the canteen and where to go stand in line, where each person would be given a hearty serving of soup. Some of these people, starving, attacked the food recklessly. One man was warned not to eat so much, but had been so many days without food that he consumed 9 bowls of the potato and turnip soup, almost 2.5 gallons in one sitting. Not long afterward, he's said to have passed away, his stomach exploding from all of the liquid. Wasyl waited to be sent somewhere to work. The next day came and went, and he was grateful for a safe place to sleep, and a few meals a day of turnip soup, and a small piece of bread, more food than he had eaten for weeks. While standing in line at the canteen, you were required to exhibit strict discipline and to be in a very straight, orderly fashion. Guards would shove, hit, and threaten those who were out of line, sometimes hitting them with the butts of their guns or their batons. At the time, some Ukrainians and Polish men started fighting with one another. Oftentimes the Polish, the Russians, and Ukrainians, despite being so close to one another in roots, they would fight and not get along. A fight ensued at this time, and some men jumped in, causing a brawl. Guards shouted, but the men did not listen, and they began beating anyone within reach with their sheathed swords. The men fought back, and all hell broke loose. After order was restored, the Germans ceremoniously rounded up all of the men and older boys in the camp, regardless of whether or not they had even been at the brawl. They were lined up into 2 straight rows. As some soldiers barked, there were other prisoners who were translators, and they were told that every 10th person was to be shot. The translator, speaking German, begged them. Many shouted in protest, "Why are you doing this? We didn't all riot." They said, "You fought, ran away, and now all of you will face the consequences for your rebelliousness." The SS went down the line and were about to begin shooting, but someone's pleading must have gotten to the person in charge. Or perhaps they needed to labor more than they needed to punish. They came up with a compromise. The men would all be sent to a forced labor camp, an Arbeitslager, all of them, for 1 year. They were relieved, and yet perhaps unaware of what terrible living conditions they were about to be heading for. What was ironic about all of this was that Wasyl that day had a bad feeling and didn't go to the canteen despite being hungry. So he was going to be punished for something, a riot that he wasn't even around. He wasn't even there. They would be sent by train to Falkenau concentration camp. Falkenau was a labor camp, slightly different than the other concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, where millions of prisoners, mostly Europeans and Jews, were systematically murdered. It wasn't as tightly secure, and it was a labor camp where many Europeans, political prisoners, religious undesirables, homosexuals, and other such persons were, quote, concentrated in one area so they could be influenced, perhaps punished, and some of them would never survive their punishment. Most of all, the Germans were determined to eke out every ounce of work they could from these men to help the war effort, and they were determined to have no dissenters and keep everyone in line. However, this camp was nearly as deadly and brutal as typical concentration camps for the many who entered and were starved to death, beaten to death, or who were outright shot. Everyone was lined up when Wasyl arrived, documented and herded into wooden train cars like cattle with no food or water. They traveled like this for 3 days, occasionally the train stopping at different locations where a bucket of water was passed around. When they arrived and the train door opened, it was both a terror and a relief to have fresh air. They entered the camp where a sign above them read, Concentration Lager Falkenau, Concentration Camp Falkenau. Wasyl was weak and hungry, having been through weeks of extremely stressful hiding and unable to really eat proper meals. He was lucky to have made it to Falkenau, where a few people may have died in transport. He was likely given orders to strip down and have his head shaven, as the Nazis collected clothing, hair, gold teeth, anything they could that would help with materials and continued support for the war effort. He gave his name and information, was assigned a number, and given some tattered rags, a thin coat and pants. Winter was approaching, and it felt as if the world had been turned upside down. Many of the other prisoners, all men, were deathly skinny and suffering from malnutrition. They were yelled at upon arriving, lined up, some to one side, others to another, as guards motioned with their gloved hands. They placed them in rows of 4, and having been stripped down, shaven, and deloused, Wasyl was assigned an area to sleep. But the barracks, already overcrowded with veteran prisoners, were overfull, with over a dozen to a bed. So Wasyl was forced to sleep on the concrete floor as temperatures reached 30 below 0 Celsius, and they continued to drop. Wasyl's health immediately began to fail. He did his best to follow orders. Early in the morning, the men were given a small piece of bread, meant to last them throughout the day, and some murky soup or some kind of drink. Those who had been in the camp already for a while instructed Wasyl not to eat all of his food at once. Then they were forced to stand for roll call. If you were not in a perfect row, at attention, you were likely to be signaled out for discipline or a beating. And if your entire block was not present, or if one or more died in the evening, you would be subject to disciplinary action. Order was everything. Not long afterward, they were marched to the coal mines, where the men, some dying, were forced to work 12 to 14 hours a day. There was a long 2-meter ditch where the men were forced to break apart and shovel coal, loading it into carts. There was also a coal mine nearby where some men worked. They were all forced to do continual labor, despite some men hardly being able to keep themselves up. Men who were too slow would be beaten. If you were collapsed, you were beaten. If anyone else tried to help you and a guard noticed, you were beaten. Sometimes the men were so frail and the beatings so severe that they were beaten to death and left as an example to the other men. They were treated worse than animals, working beyond the point of exhaustion and often struggling to get back to the barracks. The labor was difficult and the cold was unbearable. At lunchtime, men were given a short break, some water, and if they had any bread left, they could gnaw or suck on the stale piece given to them. Men were then sent back to work, often hungry, dizzy, or ill, and subject to more beatings if their pace faltered. With no restrooms or latrines, men were forced to go to the bathroom on the side of the road. As darkness approached, the men were marched back to camp in straight lines. Any men who may have died or had been killed had to be carried by those still alive. Some men, like Wasyl, were forced to scoop up human feces, anything left on the side of the road by the men who were going to and from work, and they were forced to carry that back to the camp, if for no other reason than to discipline and humiliate them. The men were lined up for another roll call, and then fed some soup, which consisted of about 3/4 of a liter of some water, and perhaps a little bit of turnips or potato. That is, if you were lucky and given a scoop from the bottom. After exhaustive labor, with already failing health, Wasyl grew more and more frail. It was the worst of winter, with temperatures reaching 20 below, 30 below, and snow covering the ground. Wasyl was sleeping on the cement floor in his barrack, and it was taking its toll on him and his body and his health, which deteriorated. He wondered if he would make it to his 17th birthday. Camp life was rough. Eventually, Wasyl made acquaintances with other Ukrainians, one or two of whom he recognized from his village. They explained how things worked, and as the weeks passed, he struggled to do what he was told. He saw men worked to death and beaten when they slowed, while he and other inmates stood helpless and unable to help. Some of the men found life hopeless, and it was as if everything had gone bad, and to some it felt as though it were the end of the world, including Wasyl. One of the Ukrainians, which was one of Wasyl's friends, named Mityfor. It was illegal to commit suicide, and while they could not punish you, they made it clear that they would punish your barrack mates if you were to try to escape or to kill yourself. Perhaps he thought it would appear an accident, but he told others beforehand what he was doing, and his actions were indeed deliberate. Mityfor waited for the train to back slowly into another car in order to connect the two train cars. At just the last second, he ran between the two trains as if to stop them, and the cars crushed his body, killing him instantly. A few others in the camp had gotten away with something similar, trying to make their death look like an accident. Growing increasingly frail and sick, Wasyl was unable to keep up with his work, trying his best when the guards were nearby, hoping they wouldn't notice his pace was slowing. He thought about what his friend had done and considered throwing himself, which he may not even be able to do at this point, in front of the train car. He would later say he believed God stopped him from doing this, because he was not really a believer then. Even though he did go to church, he didn't consider himself saved, and at this point, he didn't have anything to believe in. For many of the men, suicide seemed easier than life in the camp. Unable to eat, Wasyl lost weight, 5, 10, 20, 30 pounds, until he was under 100 pounds. Stricken with either pneumonia or typhoid fever, he soon struggled to put down what little food they were giving him. He worked 12 hours a day, shoveling coal on what many estimate to be 400 calories a day. Beaten down and sick, it got to where Wasyl, when he tried to re-eat his ration of bread, found blood pouring out of his nose and mouth. He was in constant pain, sobbing at night. One day he cut his leg and it began to bleed, but he noticed he couldn't feel it. He had no feeling in his legs, they were numb. Time moved slowly for him. He suffered and did what he was told, and grew more and more sick each day. Things were difficult for everyone in the camp. All of them were starving and losing weight. If you survived long enough, after burning all your fat, your body would begin to use muscle for fuel. Unfed, their body fed on itself. The forced work was hard enough, but the humiliation of picking up feces, the beatings, the punishments, the malnutrition, it got the better of many inmates. Escape was not considered. Those who escaped were usually found and punished, along with their bunkmates and cell block, and if they were not found, their bunkmates were punished even more to discourage the practice, and the punishment were often the cruelest. Being a forced labor camp, prisoners were allowed to have visitors, and occasionally to write home. Wasyl's family was some 200 miles away in another country, and didn't have any money to make a trip. Automobiles were uncommon, and a train ticket was much too expensive. Meanwhile, Wasyl grew sicker and sicker, having suffered harassment and beatings. Eventually, he couldn't do work any longer and developed a bad fever. One night, he needed to go to the bathroom, and there were no attendants. By this point, he was put in the infirmary, where most men were sent to die. He couldn't do any work. He couldn't even stand. He tried to hold it until he could any longer. Nobody came, and he moaned as loud as he could, crying out the only words he really knew in German. Scheiße, Scheiße, pleading for help to go to the bathroom. But nobody heard him, or they pretended not to. He finally leaned on his side and went on the floor, barely able to turn his body around. He felt hopeless, alone, even humiliated. Most of the patients were placed in the infirmary to die. They weren't really treated, and there were really no intention of nursing them back to health. Why nurse somebody back to health when you were just going to work them to death? There were no intentions to waste resources in helping them get better when they were easily replaced by those coming in on the trains. Many of the patients in the infirmary were either unconscious or semi-conscious. Due to the unsanitary condition, diseases like typhoid fever and hepatitis spread rampantly. Many patients were unconscious, and some lay dead for hours. Some even lay days before they were noticed or removed. Others were delirious, moaning and crying out in their native language. Wasyl heard moans by various men of "Mama, Mama," unsure if the men were coherent, delirious, or reliving their nightmarish past. Wasyl found himself laying in bed, in pain, and moaning when he could muster the energy to do so. For some reason, moaning helped a bit. When he was conscious, he would cry softly, thinking of his fate. A few people had visitors. Nearby, someone spoke his language and asked where his family was. Wasyl said he wasn't sure, and he said to him, "Doesn't your family know you'll die soon? That is why we're here, to die." Wasyl said they were hundreds of miles away and couldn't come. What the man said made him feel even sicker and more alone. He started sobbing to himself quietly, considering what the man said. He was probably going to die. Wasyl didn't really improve. He was in and out of a fever and eventually fell into a coma. He said he had a dream or a vision while in the coma, describing it this way. "I felt my soul begin to leave me in my dream. I saw myself at home in Ukraine, crouched under the furnace in the kitchen. It was our stove and our furnace. I cried out, 'Mama, Mama,' but she did not hear me. She spoke to my older brother. 'Let's write to Wasyl.' Then his older brother said, 'Why should we write to him if he's here?' She called out, 'Wasyl, if you're here, why can't I see you?' I answered her, 'Mama, it's because I'm no longer here. It's only my spirit that's present.' Then I felt my soul begin to leave me in the dream. But when I heard my mother's voice, it stopped. Maybe if she didn't answer, I just know it would have gone away. I lay in the bed of death alone, and there was no one with me. I was so afraid of dying. I didn't know a God. I would have died without a God. But I felt my spirit come back, and I woke up from the dream. I found out that I was in a coma. Someone told me that they thought I was dead. They never saw anyone wake up like I did. I don't know exactly how long I was in the coma. They didn't keep any records of anything because our lives didn't matter to the SS. I think it was over 2 weeks. I was awake and over a few days gained some strength so that I could sit up. Wasyl's family was hundreds of miles away in Germany, and unbeknownst to him, his mother was trying to convince officials to let her son go, but they refused. Upon receiving a letter from him describing his failing health and even the idea of suicide, she tried everything with her power to help him. She was determined to get her son, using all the money she had and borrowing anything she could from friends. She boarded a train for Falkenau. Mama Krywyn, as they called her, was a strong woman. She spoke German fluently and did not look particularly Ukrainian or Slavic. Her maiden name, Schulich, didn't necessarily sound Ukrainian either. She learned to use this to her advantage. Many mistook her for a German or Austrian native, and German officials were much less reluctant to help out one of their own. She was born in the province of Bohivna, a Poludna near Romania. She moved to where Wasyl was born. The rich mostly had farms and orchards, hiring people to come in and level the ground for planting. It was there Wasyl's father met her. They married and lived a good life together. She had 2 brothers and 1 sister. One of their brothers was a jokester and had no kids. She had a sister, Marunia, which was a version of Maria, and another brother named Petro, who had 2 kids. Many attested to what a good woman Mama Krywyn was. She herself had lived through difficult things and had a good nature. She had found work at that time and was relocated with her family in Germany. The 9 of them shared a room, even giving a 10th person a place to stay as well. Eventually the room, which was about 20 by 20 feet, held 12 people. She would often say, "They're poor, they have nothing, we must help them." And others came to rely on her generosity. Aside from the people she gave shelter to from time to time, they would share nearly everything they had. Often they would have breakfast upon finishing. They would leave the leftovers, always trying to be sure to leave some, in a small pot, and a Russian man would come pick them up later on in the afternoon. As a result of her mistaken identity as a German, she was able to get potatoes, bread, and other things that people could not get easily on the black market. Often, it seems, others were infected by her generosity, and they were obliged to help her, giving her food and other things to trade or exchange for the necessities. People wanted to help her as she helped those around her. She would be up at 5 a.m. trying to trade food coupons. Maybe she'd have a coupon for 20 grams of butter, but to make better use of it, she may have traded it for a kilogram of bread, and she would use that and stretch it as far as she could. She would then give some of the bread to someone in need. She always helped others when it was in her power. Most workers at the time were paid in coupons, tradable for food and other pantry items. However, there were no coupons for clothing yet. Mama Krywyn was able to get them anyway. For Christmas, they were given 2 ounces of whiskey per person. They had stopped drinking alcohol because it was scarce and rare and expensive. When in possession of it, it was far too valuable and could easily be traded. At the time, with about 9 or 10 people working, they put together their 20 ounces, and Mama Krywyn added a few Deutschmarks, which inflation had nearly made worthless, and she traded them for a suit and some clothing. Things were not only scarce because of the war effort, but because of bombings and fires all over the cities. As the war progressed and eventually led to more and more fighting, the factories, shops, and other stores were constantly destroyed or looted, leaving the Germans constantly trying to find and import the things they needed. Mama Krywyn was trying to keep her family together and helped anyone when it was within her power to do so. In Ukraine, before her sons hid in the forests, while they hid in their home, she often helped hide others. She did the same in Germany, helping others with shelter or food, often getting extra use of her German language skills, and helping to feed several families throughout the war. When she arrived at Falkenau, Mama Krywyn went to the Gestapo and gave the papers. He informed her Wasyl could not be released. He had to serve his entire 1-year sentence, and was only about halfway through. She tried to persuade officials and administrators to let her son go, but they would not. They took the papers away from her, yet they allowed her to see her frail son at the hospital. When Wasyl saw her, he broke into tears, sobbing, "Mama, Mama, why did you come here? Everything is trouble and terror, Mama. Please, I can't tolerate it here. I need to get out. I need to get out. I need to escape." His mother noticed that some guards were in another section, busily talking. She took her son and began walking. Wasyl walked feebly, clinging to his mother, and terrified of being noticed and being beaten or killed. Nearly a mile to go, walking through some fields right near the camp, they were spotted by a German soldier on a bike, perhaps in his 50s. He shouted at them to halt, and Mama Krywyn began talking to him in German. "Where do you think you're taking him?" asked the soldier. "I'm just taking my son for a walk," she said. Wasyl felt that it was over. He'd be sent back to the camps. He'd be killed or punished. His other campmates would be punished as well. Sometimes the Nazis would have men stand in extreme conditions, naked until they collapsed. At other times, they'd force the prisoner to strip naked and poured cold water over them while they were in the snow, again forcing them to stand at attention until collapsing. Often these men died of exhaustion or contracted pneumonia, or they collapsed prematurely and were beaten or shot. And yet there were other ways of punishing the prisoners: whipping, beatings, other devices that pulled prisoners' limbs apart. Wasyl grew dizzy, knowing he had been caught. Would his mother now be punished too? But the soldiers seemed to understand what they were doing, that a mother was trying to rescue her son. He looked at her, as if deciding what to do, and he just nodded slowly, almost in recognition, and simply said, "Oh, okay, just don't leave the camp by accident." And he let them go, driving off on his bicycle. Wasyl could not believe it. This man felt compassion for him and his mother. Perhaps he had a family of his own, or perhaps he thought they were a German family who had fallen into some bad luck. For whatever reason, Wasyl understood that this man had just spared his life and the life of his mother, as his mother, what he would call it, stole him away. They made it to a nearby train station, which was crawling with soldiers. Feeling hot and dizzy, Wasyl felt as if everyone were staring at him, as if everyone knew that he was an escaped prisoner. His mother bought some tickets and sat down in the car. Nobody said anything to them, and Mama Krywyn, or Fräulein Schulich, as she was called, did the talking. They bought a ticket and took the train, not to Ukraine, which was now an epicenter of World War II, but instead they went to Germany, where the rest of his family, his brothers and sisters, were. Wasyl was still very ill and could not eat, but slowly his mother nursed him back to health and did the paperwork for a job at a glass plant at the Schott glass factory in Jena, Germany. They taught Wasyl to work with and blow glass. He made glass for cameras, large boats, even windshields for cars. They heated the glass to a very high heat, making it almost doughy and malleable. You'd pour the hot glass into a mold and cover it with a piece of metal. When it cooled, it would take that form before they would polish and clean it. A testament to the organization of the Germans, the labor camp administration would notice Wasyl's escape not long afterward. However, when they found him 3 days later in Germany, helping with the war effort, not causing any trouble, they let him be. If you search on YouTube, you can find some information on the liberation of Falkenau years later, after the war had ended. Samuel Fuller, a soldier who would eventually become a famous American producer, captured some footage back in 1945, and he also made a movie to try to document the liberation of Falkenau by him and his soldiers. Once Wasyl was in Germany, he was shocked. After surviving the invasion in Ukraine and eventually being sent to the camp, he had the feeling the world was ending, and it wasn't just what was happening to him. Starved nearly to death in the camps, with war and death all around, with savage beatings and men dying and people starved, he thought the world had gone bad and that the end of the world had come. When he arrived in Germany, he was angry, as well as shocked, even deflated that they had food. Foreigners who worked were given shelter and food and other rations. Wasyl just could not understand why people were starving everywhere. There was food. He thought that the entire world was starving to death, that the entire world was falling apart. He couldn't wrap his head around the inhumanity of both the war and the camps. In Germany, they lived in a 20 by 20 foot room where about 10 to 12 people would sleep. Similar to a studio, they had to sleep, cook, and eat in the same room. There were 6 double bunk beds, and it was in a building with about 12 such rooms, holding about 130 people, men, women, and children. His mother had found Wasyl and some other family members work at the Schott glass factory in Jena, making instruments of all sorts. At the time, there were roughly 34,000 people working there. There was a large division secretly making ammunition that Wasyl and others weren't aware of. Wasyl found a place working with and blowing glass. They would heat the glass up to 500 degrees Celsius or 932 degrees Fahrenheit. Large fans all around them tried to suck up the heat, but it was inevitable that you would start sweating profusely while working. Because the work was extra difficult, Wasyl was given extra meat ration each week. Using a small tube in his breath, Wasyl would blow and shape the glass into various sizes, or they would pour the heated glass into mold where it would cool in place and be cleaned. There was no money, as they worked for tickets, and they traded them and collected them amongst the family. Wasyl's brother worked downstairs, where it was even more challenging, also receiving a little bit extra rations. Not long after returning with Wasyl, Mama Krywyn went to go steal her sister and daughter from a farm where they were not being well treated. Mama's fluent German once again helped her gain influence and help others in ways not common or possible for most Ukrainians. During Christmas time, everyone was given coupons for vodka. Mama Krywyn gathered them together and prepared them for trading. Meanwhile, the Allied forces were bombing in and around the area. Sometimes, even food would burn, bread, meat, or milk, as incendiary bombs fell nearby. Germany took to transporting food from other countries and sending it back home. Across the factory where Wasyl worked was another larger factory, the famous Zeiss factory, housing some 74,000 people. Although they were glass factories, they used the manufacturing to put together munitions as well. In this particular town in Jena, the glass industry was actually created, the Germans revolutionizing new ways to make glass for equipment such as binoculars, scopes, windshields for planes and boats or cars, and other things. Eventually, after the war, the Soviets would strip down some of the factories, stealing the technology and taking it east.